And when I was called and asked if I could speak or I could help with a program here for this evening, I was delighted because I've been, for the past 3 years, very passionate about the issues of wrongful convictions. And someone else said to me, well, wrongful convictions, are we going to get into something that's real controversial? And my immediate response was no, because wrongful convictions is not a controversial issue. It's an issue that we all should be very involved in, all should be very concerned about, because it addresses some serious problems in our judicial system. But I say it's not controversial because it is something that transcends your political affiliation or your religious affiliation or your age or anything else. The truth is that nobody wants the wrong person to be convicted and spend 20 years in prison like StevenBarnes has spent. Nobody does. Now, we all think the immediate response is that when someone is wrongfully convicted, that's a horrible thing for that person, for StevenBarnes or Dennis Marr or the 254, I think it is, or 255 people who have been exonerated through the Innocence Project. The truth is, it's a horrible thing for all of society, and the reason is probably brought to light by a case that was an exoneration that happened only a month ago in the city of Rochester. A fellow by the name of Frank Sterling was exonerated. He had been convicted in 1992 of murdering a 74-year-old woman in Rochester who was jogging on a jogging trail or walking on a walking trail. He happened to live near the jogging trail, and his brother happened to be a bad guy, and so he became an immediate suspect, and somehow, through a false confession and other things, a case was put together against him, and he was convicted. On April 28th this year, Frank Sterling was exonerated, totally exonerated, proved, not acquitted. There is a difference between exoneration and acquittal. An acquittal only means you are not proved guilty. An exoneration means you have been proved to be innocent. And DNA confirmed that Frank Sterling did not commit that murder in Rochester. Now, the horrible reality is this, that the DNA also confirmed that the person who committed that murder was in prison at the time, was in prison since 1995 for the 1994 murder of Callie Poulton, the 4-year-old girl in Rochester who was brutally murdered. And the reality is that had the police and the prosecutors gotten the right guy in 1992, Callie Poulton would be here today to listen to this. So the real truth is that the wrongful conviction is not only a horror story, and you'll hear that later tonight from Steven, for the person who was wrongfully convicted. It's a horror story for society because the guy who committed the crime is still out there able to commit the crime. And so this is an important issue for all of us, and it's not a political issue. It's as important for prosecutors as it is for defense lawyers. It's as important for liberals as it is for conservatives. It is an important issue. So we have to ask the question, well, how do wrongful convictions occur? And the reality is, and I'm just going to talk for a few minutes before I introduce Steven, to give you some context. The reality is that wrongful convictions occur because of certain flaws in our system. And the flaws include, what are the causes? The causes are false identifications. You get a victim of a crime, they come to court, they say, that's the man that raped me. The reality is, how many times have you been at a cocktail party and someone has walked up to you and called you by someone else's name and said, aren't you so-and-so? And you suddenly realize they've misidentified you in a casual, non-intense setting. Well, with false identifications, where crimes occur in dark alleys, under intense situations, under intense circumstances, it's very difficult to make an accurate identification. And so one of the major causes of wrongful convictions is false or wrong identifications. Part of that is due in fact to the fact that when police try to match victims with potential suspects, they do it sometimes using processes that influence the victim. In other words, they do lineups where you have a police officer who knows who the suspect in the lineup is and knows who the other guys who are just stand-ins are. And when the victim says, "I think it's number 1, and the police officer says, "Are you sure it's not number 3? All of a sudden, well, maybe it is. And the interesting thing is that in a lot of these cases, by the time that victim gets to trial, it's not, "I think it was number 3. That's the man that raped me. That's the man." And so the reality is that the process has some flaws. Another cause, other than misidentifications, is forensics, and this is something that all of you are probably very familiar with. Some forensics come up that blood types and things of this sort that are really not totally exclusionary, that really only reduce the probabilities or increase probabilities. And in some instances, prosecutors attempt to use what we call junk science. It's new, innovative, quote, innovative ways of trying to prove through science that somebody committed a crime. You're going to see that in StevenBarnes' case, junk science was one of the reasons that Steve spent 20 years in prison. Another cause is jailhouse informants. Think of it. You're sitting in jail, you've been charged with a crime, or you've been convicted of a crime, and you've got to figure out a way to not serve 3 years of your sentence, and all of a sudden you realize that in the next cell is StevenBarnes or someone else who has been charged with a crime, and you think, "I'm going to be a help to the DA. I'm going to tell the DA that this guy told me something that's going to help him get this guy prosecuted, because that's all he's concerned about, and I'm going to buy my freedom." And believe it or not, it happens more often than you imagine. The person you'll know in Stephen's case testified in 2 different murder trials as a jailhouse snitch. Jailhouse snitches. And yet jurors listen to jailhouse snitches and they think, why would this guy lie? And they believe them. So the reality is that's another cause. Jailhouse snitches are not reliable sources of the truth. There are a number of other causes, and Steve may very well cover these. Confessions. How many of you have ever been accused of doing something that you didn't do? I'm talking, go back to your childhood. Anyone. Your mother said how many of you ever, come on, there should be every hand. I've been accused. Everybody's been accused. The reality is that we deny it. Now, let me ask you this next question. How many of you think that if you were brought into a police station and told that you are a suspect in a murder case, how many of you think that you would ever, under any circumstances, confess to that crime if you didn't commit it? Is there anyone in this room that thinks that they would? How many think that anyone would confess to a crime that they did not commit? The reality is, in New York State, there have been 25 exonerations through DNA, through the Innocence Project. 25 documented cases. In 10 of those 25 cases, there were what we call false confessions. People who actually confessed to crimes that they did not commit. And mostly to save their rear ends. Because they were being told that if they didn't, oftentimes, that they were going to be sent to an electric chair and die, and this officer was going to save their life. The reality is false confessions happen, and people, jurors, don't believe it. So these are the issues. These are the causes. You're going to learn through Stephen how this happens in his case, but these are the real causes. one of the things that, and I got, actually, I think this whole evening came about because Ed Bradley and I got into a conversation about 3 weeks ago, and I got on this passion of the Innocence Project and started talking about it. And one of the things he said, well, do these people get compensated? I mean, you know, Steven spent 20 years in prison. Some of these people, I was in Atlanta last month. I was in Atlanta for 3 days at a National Innocence Project conference. And the first person I met when I walked in was a fellow from Florida who introduced himself as James Bain. And I said, James, and I knew he was an exoneree, and I said, how long, when did you get out? And he said, in December. This guy was the most smiley, gentle, nicest guy you could have met. I mean, if you'd met him on the street, you would have struck up a conversation with him. He said, so, James, how long were you incarcerated? 35 years. 35 years. I said, how old are you? He said, 52. He said, wait a second, it's 36 years. 36 years in prison. Went to prison when he was actually 17 years old. His case was on CNN last week. It is an incredible story. So these people, these are just incredible stories, and you wonder how they can survive them. Now, tonight I'm going to talk about Steve Barnes, and I would like to introduce him. But let me just give you just a 2-3 minute background on how I became involved in StevenBarnes. In 2008, I became president of the Oneida County Bar Association. And when I became president, I decided we had to have some kind of program in Oneida County. I had just learned about the Innocence Project. I had become consumed by it. And I said, we really have to have a program that will create public awareness about the fact that people get wrongfully convicted. And so I contacted the Innocence Project. I actually called to see if Barry Scheck would come up and speak. Barry Scheck is the founder of the Innocence Project and represented O.J. Simpson unfortunately his claim to fame, that he represented O.J. Simpson in the criminal trial on the DNA issues. They said Barry was not available, but I got an email 3 hours later saying Madeline DeLone, who is the executive director of the Innocence Project in New York, would be delighted to come up. And so she came up, and where's the newspaper I had? Right here. Okay. She came up on Law Day, which was May 1st of that year. And before she came up, I tried to get the Utica Observer-Dispatch to publicize the fact that we had Maddie DeLone coming up. Now, we were not only bringing Maddie in, but we also decided that what would make the program interesting, as tonight, is to bring an exoneree in. So we had arranged to bring Roy Brown. Roy had been convicted in Cayuga County, had spent 15 years in prison, had been released a year earlier, and Roy was going to come up and speak about his experience. I kept calling the Utica paper saying, you've got to publicize this. This is an important issue. It's an exciting issue. This is going to be an incredible program. And I couldn't get much of a response. And so finally, 2 days before, I said, look, you've got to have an article. I had sent them a press release. And so Rocco DeLuca called me and said the next day, and he said, you know, I'm finally getting to this. This is 2 days before. He said, and I actually called the Oneida County District Attorney's Office and asked them, what do they think about the Innocence Project? I had not heard anything about it. And the DA said to me, I think they're okay. As a matter of fact, they're investigating a case that's in our office. And the following morning, the day before our Law Day, the headline was, a banner headline on the front of the Utica paper, DNA tests may prove if Barnes killed girl. This was April 30th, 2008. And so we did the program the next day, and who should walk up to me the next day during the program, or after the program, but a woman by the name of Sylvia Bouchard, who's sitting over at that table. And Sylvia walked up to me and said, Mr. Golden, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Sylvia Bouchard. my son is StevenBarnes, and I was amazed. And she said, I came here because I wanted to meet Maddie DeLone, who was the executive director of the Innocence Project. I introduced them, and long story short, they had a wonderful conversation. I took pictures of them. About 3 weeks later, I was approached by Bob Mortis from the Munson William Proctor Arts Institute, who said, you know, this was such an incredible program. We really have to do this in a more diverse way. And so what we did was we arranged a 5-day program in the fall of 2008, and that was called The Art of Innocence. And in that program, we interspersed movies of the movie After Innocence and the live production of the play The Exonerated with exonerees. We brought in 3 exonerees, one who was in the movie After Innocence. We brought in the producer of After Innocence, and we did this incredible program. But what was amazing to me was that there were 6 programs. In 5 of those programs, a woman stood up during the question and answer period, a woman who I grew to know very closely, Sylvia Bouchard. And she got up and she said to the audience, I'm Sylvia Bouchard, and I want you to know what it's like to be the mother of someone who has spent the last 19 years in prison for something he had nothing to do with. And by the time Sylvia told her little 3-minute story, you would look around the room and there was not a dry eye in the room. And when the show ended, people were hovering around Sylvia as much as they were hovering around the exoneree. I came to know and love Sylvia. Sylvia is just a wonderful person, and she fought for 20 years, never celebrated a holiday, never celebrated birthdays, never celebrated Christmas, because it would not be right without Steven. And she said to me, and she said at the end of each of those question and answer period, my hope and prayer is that Steven will be home to spend Christmas with me this year. Now, at that point, we knew DNA was being tested. We knew the results were not yet in. We didn't know the outcome. 2 weeks after that program, the beginning of November of 2008, at 11 o'clock at night, I came home. I had an email from Maddie DeLone, executive director of the Innocence Project. Larry, call me. I have news for you. And I sent her back a quick email saying, it's 11 o'clock at night. I just got home. I will call you first thing in the morning. And 5 minutes later, my phone rang, and it was Maddie, and she said I wasn't going to wait. Steven's coming home. And I can't tell you the feeling that I had, because I had grown so close to this situation. It was just incredible. And so I was there, and incidentally, Barry Scheck, who had not come up for our Law Day program, came up at the end of November for the exoneration or for the liberation of StevenBarnes. And it was probably one of the most incredible days of my life. I was there when it happened. I watched the handcuffs come off his hands and wrists, and drop to the floor in a courtroom that was dead silent until that clunk hit the floor. And it was just amazing. And so I've grown to know Steven, and Steven and I have become good friends since then. I've grown to know him, and his is a story that has to be shared with the world, because what happened to Steven shouldn't happen to anybody, but could happen to anybody. And so with that, I'd like to introduce StevenBarnes.
Thank you, Larry. First of all, I want to say thank you for having me here. I was going to talk over there, but I figured I didn't want to crowd everybody over there. So there's a few people in this room that knows me, but I was going to tell you about my experience, what happened to me from 1985 to 2008. Back in September of 1985, I lived in the town of Marcy my whole life, up on Kavanaugh Road. And September 18th, 1985, I went to a roadblock on the corner of Mohawk Street and Route 49. They showed me a picture of a girl and asked me if I'd seen her. I said no. I went about my business. And I went to my buddy's house, split wood all that day down in Kenwood, down by Woodlawn Place, down in near, now it's Walmart. It used to be Riverside Mall. On my way home at 4 o'clock, I was going by on Route 49 past Marcy Discount Beverage, and I went by it and I wanted to get a six-pack, so I turned around and nice and easy. It's now a track. And there was an unmarked car on the payphone, and I circled around a nice and easy parking lot, went back to Marcy Discount, and an unmarked cop car pulled in behind me and asked me why I turned around, and asked me for my registration, asked me why my truck was muddy, asked me for my driver's license, and we're investigating a young girl that was murdered and her body on Mohawk Street, and I went through the roadblock, and they said, you look suspicious driving through the parking lot. I said, well, I was just driving down the road, and I forgot, I was 19 years old, turned around in the parking lot, and from that day on was the worst days of my life. I went home, told my mom what happened, and 3 days after that, they called me up to the sheriff's department to interrogate me. Well, I was 19 years old, and they asked me to come up and answer them some questions about this murder, and it was probably the worst 12 hours of my life. For the first hour, they were all nice to me. They asked me questions, where I was on this night, September 18th, 1985, and I told them what I did from the day I got up till I went to bed. Well, after the first hour, they started accusing me of this. They said I was a liar. I was full of crap. I did this. They verbally harassed me. They looked me in the eye and said, we know you did this. You're lying. After about 6 hours, they asked me if they could search my vehicle. I signed a waiver. And I always told the sheriff's department I had nothing to hide. I had nothing to do with this. Cooperate. I let them search my truck. They fingerprinted, dusted my truck. They fingerprinted me. They vacuumed my truck. After about 10 hours, they asked me to take a polygraph test. They threw me in a cop car and took me to State Troopers Barracks in Oneida. I took a polygraph test, and on the way home from Oneida, the two sheriff's departments said to me, would you like to stop at McDonald's or Burger King and have a break? I said, I don't want nothing from you people. I just want to get home. My mother doesn't know where I am. When I was interrogated, I asked for a phone call. I asked to call a lawyer. I was denied everything. 3 days after that interrogation, or 2 days after, I was telling my mom about it and stuff, but the sheriff's department used to follow me around, and about 6 months after interrogation, they asked me to come up to the hospital to take blood and saliva and hair from me, which I always cooperated, and I went up. They actually drove me up there. We went to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and after they took my blood and everything, for the next 2 years, the sheriff's department followed me around. I work construction in the area. I built a lot of homes, and they used to follow me around. They talked to friends of mine, people that I thought were my friends. They had some ex-girlfriend. But for 2 years that I was, before they arrested me, they made my life hell. It's just, they followed me and harassed me. And from 1985 to 1988 was probably the worst years of my life, but I remember March 25th, 1988, I was home with my brother and my girlfriend Lori at the time, and the sheriff's investigators come knocking on my mother's door and said, hi, you remember us? And I said, how can I forget you people? You made my life miserable for the last 3.5 years. They said, you're under arrest for the murder of Kim Simons. Well, my brother flipped out. My girlfriend was crying. I was spazzing out. I said, this can't be happening, you know. But I remember they threw me in a cop car and they brought me over to Judd Road at a law enforcement building, and they called the newspaper. And back then, the county jail was right across the street. It's a new place now, but years ago it was a small place. And they called the OD and everybody, and they paraded me across to the county jail like I was some trophy buck. And I remember I was in the county jail over 30 days, and while I was there, the sheriff's department questioned people there, and when Mom, Judge Buckley finally posted bail after 30 days of while I was in the county jail. My mom put her house up, money in the bank. It was, you know, times were tough back in the 80s. It isn't like it is today, but when I got out on bail, I was on a curfew. I couldn't do nothing, but I had to be home at a certain time. But what the sheriff's department did was, when I got out on bail, that they went on the gallery and questioned anybody that was on my gallery. Asked them, you know. I always tell people that it's like the cops play Monty Hall. It's an old game show. Let's make a deal. And the cops will say, you know, say this about StevenBarnes, and we'll give you a time cut. And you know, say this, and you know, we'll give you a time cut. But back in them days, it was different. People. They tried to get a lot of people to say stuff about me, but they got one person that, you know, said that I told him that I did this, which wasn't true. But that's when I always say that the cops always try to make deals with people. But I was out on bail for a little over a year, and it was in May of 1989 my trial started. And my trial lasted for 14 days. Well, for 14 days, I had to sit there and listen to people lie about me, say stuff about me that wasn't true. In my case, they had, like Larry said earlier, it was junk science. When they searched my truck in 1985, they said they found similar hair of the victim. They said they found a similar gene imprint on the side of my truck, and they said they found similar dirt under my rear wells of my truck. And they went to the crime scene after 2.5 years and took dirt, and they said it was similar. And they had the jailhouse informant, and they had an off-duty cop in my case. He was an off-duty Utica cop. He said he was driving down Mohawk Street with his wife, and back in 1985 he didn't know who it was or who he saw or what vehicle he saw. But in 1988 and 89, when 88 in the grand jury, he said that his mind got better and he picked me out and my vehicle. But what the cops did is they had a photo layup of trucks, and mine was only the one that was semi-red. And people that were in the lineup, I was the only blonde guy in the lineup, and they asked him, who's the blonde guy? He said, but I was the only one in the lineup that had blonde hair, and my truck was the only one that had red. It was a red truck in the lineup. But it was an election year that year, and that off-duty cop wanted to run for undersheriff for the sheriff's department that year. They had, like I said, the junk science, the jailhouse informant. Then they had a friend of mine that I thought was a friend of mine. He said he was going on a drug bus with a cop, and he was driving down Mohawk Street, and he saw my vehicle there. The night I left my house, I went to a gas station on Route 49, and the gas station attendant said that I went down Mohawk Street, which I went down Route 49 to the bowling alley, and he later admitted he lied. But after 14 days of listening to people lie, similarities, maybes, perhaps, my jury went out, and they were out for almost 2 days. And It was June 2nd, 1989. They came back, and I remember looking at Salvatore Capislaccio, who was my trial attorney back then. And every day my jury used to come in, they used to look at me, and that day they came in and they wouldn't even look me in the eye, and I looked at Cappy and I said, this isn't good, you know, they're not. And I remember when they stood up and the jury foreman said that they found me guilty. It was probably the saddest day of my life. I remember Capislaccio looked at me and he said, I'm awful sorry. And I looked at him and I just couldn't believe this happened to me. I was, 23 years old. I just got convicted of a crime that I did not commit. For the next 3 months, me and Cappy tried to get a retrial, postponed sentencing, but in September, they sentenced me to 25 to life. I went upstate. I was 23 years old. I'd never been in trouble in my life. I never knew what prison was about. I walked into Wendy Correctional Facility, and I was probably only there not too long, and I had a fight. But prisons, I don't know if anybody's familiar with prison, but I call it hell on earth. You're forced to live around people you hate. I figured when I first went into that prison, I would only be there a couple of years, and I said, I'll get, on appeal and stuff, but little did I realize that after my appeals and everything, it almost took me 20 years, but at that time, I never thought it would, but I remember I exhausted my appeals. Capislaccio did my appellate appeal, and Court of Appeals, they denied me entry. And then in 1991, he had a massive heart attack and died. And I remember I was watching, my mom was too, we were watching Phil Donahue. It was back in 1992, 93. Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld founded the Innocent Project. And they had guys on the show that got exonerated through DNA. And I wrote them a long letter, so did my mom, and they agreed to take on my case. It was 94. Back then, our congressman, our Curie right now, was the DA back then. Good thing they had the evidence. The district attorney, they was very cooperative. We agreed on a lab. Back then, my mother had to pay for the DNA testing, but after over a year and a half, my mother came to visit me one day, and I was so, I said, this is it, I'm coming home. But the way they collected evidence in the 80s that, and how they put, it was a murder rape, and they put solutions on the slide that broke down any testing for DNA. My mother came up to visit me on a Saturday and said, I got some bad news. The DNA came back inconclusive. And I had my hopes set so high that I was coming home that year. But when I dealt with the Innocent Project, there was a lady. Her name was Christine Doyle. She was a law student. She got a law degree, and she was running Amnesty International, and she agreed to help me. She was trying to put an actual innocent motion in for me, and I remember I wrote her one day, and my letter came back, and my mom sent her money and stuff, and I thought she blew me off, but that's later on. I'll tell you what happened to her. But for 7 years, I tried to find her, and I never found her. But my case was dormant for a long time. While I was in prison, I always kept busy. I worked out. I studied. I was a sign language interpreter for 2 years. I encountered a lot of violence. I seen guys stabbed. I seen guys, murdered. I seen guys burned up. I don't know if anybody could ever, visualize what I seen, but to this day I still have nightmares about what I seen, and The cops weren't the nicest people in the world. Prison's designed to break you down mentally and physically, but I never let it, you know what I mean? I always had support from my family, and I always stayed strong, and I always kept hope alive. What I always think of hope as alive, I always had a candle lit, in my mind, that as little as the flame got, it always stayed lit. And I said, someday I'm going to walk out of here. I had guys in prison telling me that, yeah, everybody says they're innocent, So after a while, I never, I got done. I didn't say a lot to a lot of guys that, because nobody believed you anyways. Everybody says, But through the years in prison, I watched, the population changed. I watched governors change. I watched, people change. Through the years, the prison, they dropped down. They eliminated programs. Younger people came in. They were more violent. It's just, prison's only designed for the strong and to survive. And I always stayed strong and kept to myself. And I never had a lot of friends in prison. I always called them associates. The only friends I had when I got arrested and convicted and sent upstate was my mother, my brother, and my sister. A lot of people don't realize that, all your friends, you could have your close friends, you could have friends that you've known your whole childhood life. Some of them are going to, the cops, coerce them to saying stuff, say this about Barnes, and, we can bring up past stuff and this and that. And it's, you don't have any friends when you get in trouble. It's how the system is. It's designed to put you away, but it's hard. They can indict a bologna sandwich, that's what I tell people, but you can't. To get out of prison, it's very hard. It took me all them years, but my little brother in 2006, every year the Innocent Project has a seminar, a conference in every state. And my little brother went to Boston that one year and spoke on my behalf, and the Innocent Project agreed to reopen my case. I was the 18th person in New York State to write the Innocent Project back in 1993 to take on my case. And when they agreed to take on my case again, and I remember the chaplain came, I was out in Southport, out near Elmira, and I was working for a chaplain out there, and she came to my cell. It was probably a little after 12. And anybody comes to if a chaplain comes to your cell when you're locked up, you always automatically think that somebody died. I lost a lot of all my grandparents in prison. And I remember the chaplain saying, "It's not bad news. Your mom just called, and the Innocent Project agreed to reopen your case." Well, from that day on, it was a year and a half. We found the evidence. Good, thank God, and the DA's office still had the evidence. We agreed on a lab. Me and the Innocent Project attorneys. They went. It was in Selmark down in Texas, one of the best labs in the country. They sent all the evidence down there, and over a year and a half, the DNA test came back, and they said they had 2 DNA male profiles, and it was in about October of 2008. They came up take my DNA, and I remember the 2 investigators. They said, "We're here. We were opening Simon's case, and we're here for you." And my lawyer said, "Don't talk to him." And they swabbed my cheek. And there was a lady from the lab swabbed my cheek, and from the day they took my DNA, it was approximately 7 days later. I called home, and it was November 21st, 2008. I used to call my mother on Friday night. It was exactly a Friday night, November 21st. And she says, the Innocent Project called. And I always had it in the back of my head that, something, I always hoped for the best, expected the worst, because I always had a lot of ups and downs. It was over 19 years I had in, and she said, call back in half an hour, and I waited. I was pacing and because we locked in at 5 o'clock, so I called my mom. It was like 4:35, and I remember she said to me, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "No, we didn't have chairs by the phone." She said, "You're coming home." And I said, "Huh?" And she goes, "Yeah, you're coming home." And I remember I dropped the phone on the gallery, and I yelled down the gallery to some guys, and I said, "I'm going home. My nightmare's over." A lot of people don't realize that freedom is just, to some people, it's just a word, but when it's gone, when you don't have your freedom and it's snatched away from you, and then you get it back, it's like, it was the greatest feeling in the world. I started crying that day, and I remember almost 20 years before that, it was tears of sadness, and that day it was tears of joy. It was probably the happiest day of my life, one of them, but I remember I called the Innocent Project, and I was talking to my staff attorney, and and she told my mother on the phone that, what are you doing for Thanksgiving? And she said to my mother, set another plate because Steve's coming home. Well, for almost 20 years, I didn't celebrate Christmas. I didn't celebrate birthdays, New Year's. Don't tell me good morning. It was my day in prison every day was the same. It didn't matter if it was Christmas. It didn't matter if it was a Monday or it was a Saturday. I did the same stuff every day. Only on the weekends I didn't work, you know what I mean? But I was always told what to do. And I remember they brought me back. I had to stay in the county jail. I had to stay in prison for Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and they brought me back to court on Monday. And then my attorney couldn't come up from the city, so they couldn't get a night till later on that night. So I had to stay one more night in the county. And I remember when they brought me to court, and it was November 25th, 2008, and they brought me in United County Court, and I remember I walked in there, was more media and people that I haven't seen in years, and cameras, and I remember I walked up to the podium, my lawyer was there, and Barry Sheck was there, and my heart was doing 100 miles an hour, and I looked up at the sky, and I said, "Heart, don't fail me now," you know what I mean? You're home. I remember the judge said, "Vacated my sentence, and you're free to go home." And I remember they dropped I call it prison jewelry, they dropped all the prison jewelry on the floor, and you could probably hear a pin drop in there. And from that day, for the next 6 months, I had to rebuild my life. I was almost 43 years old. I didn't know what a cell phone was. I didn't know what the internet was. I didn't have a driver's license. I always told people I was not street smart, I was prison smart. So I had to start over. I was like a 16-year-old kid. And I remember we went to Delmonico's in North Utica, and we had a big sit-down dinner. And the food in prison is very, very garbage. It's the worst. I wouldn't feed it to my dog. But I remember the lady in Delmonico's brought me over a steak, and it was quite big. And I said to her, "What would you like me to do with that?" Because I've never, for 20 years, I didn't see a steak. I said, "I cannot eat this all." And I ate a little piece of it, and I had a shrimp cocktail. And I remember driving up on Kavanaugh Road, and my brother was driving, my mother and my stepdad, and they were all in the car. And I was just looking around, and I couldn't imagine it all. In the past 20 years, all the changes, residential, trees. I was like a kid in a candy store. I was looking around, and landmarks that I knew in the area when I left in the 80s weren't there no more. I remember when I first walked into a Walmart store, I didn't know what it was. I couldn't believe you could walk into a store, and they got a bank, hair salon, nail place, get your car fixed, shop, go over here, buy clothes. And, I was in there for like an hour looking around. I never experienced, because when I left, it was Riverside Mall, and now you got a Walmart. And it was just small things, like small things to you people was a big thing to me, to sit down and have a dinner like we had tonight with actually a nice fork and a knife. We didn't have that in prison. They gave us a spork. It was a spoon with little prongs on it. And they tell you to eat spaghetti with it. You know what I mean? It's just, that's what I say. It's like you don't understand when your freedom's gone, and then when you get it back, it's just like. And I remember I woke up that one morning when I got home on November 25th, I woke up on the 26th, and me and my mom had to go to Syracuse because they want to do an interview on CNN and MSNBC, and everybody wants to do interviews now. And my mother had a little dog, and they took it out, and I was gone for like an hour and a half. And here I am in the house that I grew up in, and I just, took a walk and enjoyed my freedom. And my mother said, "Where you been?" And I said, "It was just nice to take a walk, nobody tell me what to do, enjoy my freedom, listen to the birds chirp." It was in November, it was still cold, which I didn't care, but it's just the way prison was. It was very stale air. It was what I used to tell people at prison: you're forced to live around people you hate. You got to listen to people talk crap all the time, and it's just constant noise. I remember when I first got to my mom's house, I stayed at my mom's house until I got my job and got on my feet, but I used to sleep on the couch because my prison bed was the same size as the couch. And I remember I used to get up sometimes in the middle of the night, and I'd walk to my mother's front door, and I thought it was my gate. And I'd be on the gate like it was my bars, and my mom used to wake me up, and because I forgot where I was. Here's the house I grew up in, and now I always had, I'm just having flashbacks from prison. I suffer from like post-traumatic stress syndrome, like people that were in the service or Vietnam. I always have flashbacks from prison because I almost spent more time in prison than I did on the street, but for no reason at all. But I've been out almost 19 months. June 25th will be 19 months. I was thankful enough that Nida County, Anthony Pacenti and Scott McNamara, which is our DA, they gave me a job. I was only home probably 4 or 5 months, and they gave me a job working for the county. I used to counsel ex-inmates getting out of prison. I did that for a while. Then last summer, I ran a summer youth program. We got 600 kids jobs in the area. And then this last August, I took a job, youth build. I work with kids, 19 to 24-year-olds. They go to GED class 2 days a week, and we work construction. And we're going to start building a house in July with Habitat for Humanity down on Lansing Street. I always tell my kids my story. I call them kids. I'm 44 years old, so my kids are like 19, 20, 21, 22. And they always, what amazes me when I was that age, I was more energetic and I always wanted to, work and do everything. But these kids today, they come to work in the morning. I say, "Hey, how you doing today?" And the first thing they tell me is they're tired. Oh, everybody's tired. I says, it's just, we're here to help you. It's just the generation that it is now. It's just different when I was that age. But it's, it's just the way these kids are. I understand they've had troubles and they live in, most of them are on parole, probation, single family homes, mothers, there's no more father. But it's just, and I do a lot of work with the Innocent Project. I call them my second family. They're down in New York City. I was number 24 in New York State. I was number 227th in the country. But I always call them my second family because if it wasn't for them, they financially helped me when I got out. They had a social worker on hand. I used to talk to her. I still talk to her to this day. I do a lot of public speaking for them. I was just down to Albany last week. I was in Congress. I remember last January, Congressman Arcuri took me to see the president speak. I've been to Albany a bunch of times. I spoke at every college in this area, criminal justice classes. They're putting a bill in front of New York State now for wrongful convictions. I was just out there a week ago, this past Wednesday. I got to go back there on Monday. It's just, the bill is, like Larry spoke about it earlier, jailhouse informants, filming interrogations. I wish they had, when I got interrogated for 12 hours, I wish they had a camera in there because I asked for a phone call. I asked for call a lawyer. I asked to call my mother, and I was told I was never ever asked for it. But when the cops, people always believe the cops, but they don't believe us. But to this day, the cops that interrogated me, they're retired, and one of them lives in Florida, and one lives up here. They don't want to know nothing. The off-duty cop that his mind got better after 3.5 years that picked me out, he's elderly man now, and the new investigators went over to see him, and he said, it's my story, and I'm sticking with it. There's 4 people that were in my trial that admitted they lied. Nothing can happen to them because after 10 years, the statute of limitation runs out. I'm one of the fortunate ones, when I got out. In January 9th of 09, I got out in November, but in January 9th of 09, they dismissed all my charges, exonerated me. I was fully exonerated, and Mr. Scott McNamara gave me a public apology on TV. A lot of people don't get that, but I've done radio talk shows with Scott. We became good friends. I was one of the fortunate when I got out. I had a lot of community support, family support. A lot of guys don't have that when they're in prison with their families. What I've been through, I like to tell my story because it happens to a lot of people, more people than you people think. They got another 20-something guys out after me in the last 19 months. I was down in Atlanta. Larry was there. There was 86 of us on stage. And it was they did up all the time. It was well over 3,000 years that we did for no reason at all. It's just, that's what always people say, well, you'll get compensated. But I lost, 7 years in my 20s, every day in my 30s, and 3 years in my 40s, I got friends of mine that I haven't seen in years. They have families, they have careers. They got kids that are teenagers. I missed out on all that. I missed, the prime years of my life for no reason at all. A lot of my friends, they asked for their life. They chose the career. I didn't ask to go to prison. I got snatched up, railroaded, called a liar, and thrown in prison. And I thought I'd be home in a couple of years, but it took me almost 20 years to prove my innocence. And thank God they didn't have the death penalty, because if they had the death penalty, they probably would have executed me, and I wouldn't be here today. There's a case down in Texas, a guy, they executed him in 2004, and then they 2008, they proved that it wasn't him. But that's why I don't believe in the death penalty. But everybody has their opinion on the death penalty. I'm not going to say everybody in prison is innocent, but there's they say approximately 6% of guys in prison are innocent, but a lot of cases, the Innocent Project they have 60 active cases per year. Only 1% of them get out because a lot of times the evidence is destroyed. It's just, in a lot of cases, it's most of the ones the Innocent Project take are DNA. A lot of guys get coerced into false confessions, jailhouse informants. That's what this whole bill is that I'm fighting in Albany for now, to bring in front of the state. But it's just the system. A lot of people, I was brought up to believe that the system is the best. Cops are the greatest people, and somebody gets arrested, they're guilty, and they should be sent away. But that's how the jury system thinks. When they see somebody, well, they arrested this guy, so he must be guilty, and send him upstate, and that's the way people think, you know what I mean? But that's not always the case. I always try, I try to change the system. I'll never change it. It'll never be perfect, but that's why I always go to talk. The Innocent Project tries to change laws. They back us. Some states, they don't have compensation laws. New York State is one of them, but, it might take me years to even get any money. I'm thankful that I got a job with benefits, that I have medical and stuff, but a lot of guys get out of prison, they don't have none of that stuff, you know what I mean? They don't have a family. I was thankful to have all that, you know what I mean? And it's just, I've been out almost 19 months. It feels like I've been home probably 7, 8 years. I remember in prison, time never so slow. It was because it was the same day over day over day. But on the street, say you don't like somebody, you can avoid them. But in prison, you lived around people you had beef with, and you had to deal with them every day. You had to see them, you had to hear their mouth. Out here on the street, as I say, if you don't want to talk to somebody, you just avoid them. But in prison, I always say, you're forced to live around somebody you hate, and the cops aren't the nicest people. COs come to work, they have a beef with their girlfriend or their wife, and they take it out on us. You know what I mean? I've had altercation with the COs. It's like anything else. Some of the COs are good, some are bad. Like the inmates, some are good, some are bad. But it's just the system. When I first came in the 80s, the system, there was a lot of togetherness. And now when I got out in 2008, there's what's the problem now is that the state of New York is so financially, the economy's everything messed up, so they're eliminating programs. So all these guys that are coming in, the only thing they're giving them is school, get a GED, and there's a lot of gang activity, and you got violence, and it's just, it's not getting any better. It's getting worse. I remember when I was only home a year, I went back to the prison I got released from, and me and my mom went. It was right before Christmas it was Christmas '09. Yeah. And I said to my mom when I walked out, I said, it's nice to walk out of the place and then back in it. You know what I mean? Because I lived in my cell was, I don't know if you ever, any of the guys used the men room right here. My cell was a little bit smaller than that. You know what I mean? I told people I lived in a closet for 20 years. So to this day, I always, I try to, I don't, the way I lived in prison is the way on the street, it's a little different. I don't trust everybody. I go to a crowded place. I always put my back to like I'm talking to you, I got my back to nobody's behind me. You know what I mean? That's the way prison was. You always had to look over your shoulder. And I'm slowly working on that. And it's just, I'm just happy to be home and getting my life on track. And I met a lot of wonderful people. I met all you people tonight. I know a few people here tonight, but it's just, freedom's great. I always tell everybody I live each day like it's a holiday. I always walk around with a smile on my face. My day starts at 4. I worked out in prison all them years, and I still work out. I get up at 4 in the morning. I go to the gym for 2 hours. I go home and get ready. I go up, check on my mom, and then I go to work. I work, my office is right on Elizabeth Street. I look out my office window, and I look at the United County Courthouse. That's where I got out. And I park my truck right in the same parking lot and I look down the steps that I came out of that day, you know what I mean? So, and today, my kids, my program, we planted flowers all the way around the county building today, you know what I mean? And I seen people come out of there, I was talking, everybody knows me. I'm always on the news and everything. Everybody wants, well, you're like a celebrity. I don't want to be a celebrity, you know what I mean? I just want to be StevenBarnes, live my life. Maybe I'll meet the right girl someday, and I'm only 44, have a family, have a house, And I always tell people, life begins at 40. But, so. And I just want to, thank you for having me, and, I thank you for sharing my story with you and meeting everybody. And I don't know if anybody has any questions, because I know a lot of people, when I talk, they always want to ask questions. So if you want to ask any questions, feel free to. But I just want to say thanks again, and it was a pleasure to. Yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I was telling you about the lawyer that she was a law student with the Innocent Project. She became part of my. She was working on my case. When the Innocent Project reopened my case in 2006. They put an investigator on her, and she had all my trial transcripts and my police reports. And they told my mother that she got in a car accident and was in a coma. And to this day, she still is in a coma, and she doesn't know who I am. She still has all my transcripts, my police reports, and thank God my mother had another copy of everything up in the attic that she stumbled across. But I heard she's still in a coma, and she's starting over like she's a little baby, like a young. She's the same age as me, and it would have been a problem. Because if I write the courts and ask them, can I get my, they don't want to give us our stuff. You know what I mean? It doesn't. No. Yeah, it costs. Yeah. And I remember when I got out, Mr. McNamara got a copy of my transcripts. He gave them to me because eventually I'm going to have somebody write a book or do a movie. And I don't know if anybody ever watched America's Most Wanted, but they put the case on back in March. I went on the air and told them my story, part of it. My mom was there. And they got a lot of new leads on the case, and I'm hoping this year or in the near future that they bring the real people to justice that did this. They always said it was one person, but now they said it's a group of people. Where they found her body on Mohawk Street, that's not the place she was murdered at. A lot of stuff's coming to light. People are coming forward that didn't want to come forward before. The original cops that investigated stuff, they didn't make the right reports. They didn't make any reports. Stuff disappeared. When people put my name in the mix, and they were like horses when they got blinders on, that's the cops focused on me, and that's all they did for 3.5 years. And it was an election year, and they didn't care who they did, who they railroaded, but they wanted this solved. And it's sad what they did to me. A lot of people say, "Oh, why don't you hate this person or hate?" You know what I mean? I lived in a stressful environment for 20 years. I don't want to walk around and hate the world. I just want to live my life now, and do my thing. If I want to stop here, if I want to go here, if I want to go to this place and have dinner, if I want to stop here and have a beer, I can do that. I don't have to listen to, excuse me, officer, can I go take a shower? Or, CO, can I go to the yard? Or, for 20 years I was told what to do. I just want to live my life, and I told Scott McNamara and the investigators now, I said, I always try to help you, whatever I can do possible to bring the real people to justice, I will. And when they arrest the real people, I told Scott McNamara, I said, you can just put me in the back room with them for about 4 minutes. But I know that won't happen, but I would just ask him why. How did you live, like Larry said, when I was away for 20 years for something I didn't do, when they arrest the real people, or the person or persons, you don't know what they did in the last 20 years. They could have committed another crime. And that's what they always say. They would rather let 10 guilty people free than lock one innocent person away. Because when one innocent person's locked up and the real person's out and they're doing more crimes, you don't know how many person could have committed 2 more crimes, 3 more crimes. And that's what's the bad thing about it, about wrongful convictions. I mean, it's just there's guys in other states that were police officers. The system doesn't care who you are or what your career is. I was in prison with guys that were lawyers, doctors, paramedics. Jail don't care who you are or what your career is. They just some of these small counties and towns, they want convictions. They don't care who takes the fall for it. They don't care. And what happens to a lot of these people, they don't have the money to fight for their innocence. My mom was ready to, mortgage her house again. I mean, it's just, but I just, I don't want to sit here and preach religion, but, I always kept, God in my heart when I was locked up, and I went to church, and I kept hope alive, and I'm glad I'm free, and I just love my freedom, and I just want to say thank you again, Thank you very much.
Steve, would you introduce your mother?
Oh, this is my mom, Sylvia, my best friend.
Thank you very much for inviting Steve and I here tonight. It's a real honor to be with you. I just want to let everyone know I have never been ashamed of my son. He might have been in maximum security prison. I was never ashamed of him. I'm ashamed of our judicial system that let this happen, and they did let it happen. People quite often say to me as we speak, as a mother, how did you ever do this? And I always say, as a mother, how do you not? How could I walk away from my son, especially when I knew he was innocent? To spend 20 years going to visit your son every Saturday and walk out the door with a metal door clanging, you felt so helpless. We were all incarcerated. Our lives literally stood still for 20 years. It was the first thing I thought of in the morning, and it was the last thing I thought about before I went to bed at night. And Steve thinks his case was dormant for a while. It was never dormant. We tried every single day to get Steve out of jail. I used to tell him that there was only one place you couldn't get back from, and that was the grave. And as long as he was alive, there was hope. And if it was my last dollar and my last breath, I'd fight to get him out. And it darn near took both. People quite often ask me about what it was like when I got the news. I was thrilled when Maddie DeLone called me and told me